Almighty God, thank you so much for the music, for the youth, and the work that you are doing in us. We thank you for the break that we've had, the time to refresh. And as we return to our study, we just ask you to continue, that your presence would be with us as we strive to review and rightly understand the message as you've given it to us. We praise you and we thank you, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so did you want to start with the one line that I was talking about? Would that be helpful?
I think it would be helpful because that's where our minds were still on that.
Because I'm going to go back and find that particular. It was really early on. Yeah, okay. And I'll just go through it. And okay, so this was the board work from Protestantism Divided. We're not going to talk about this right now. That'll be for when we get there. But what I was working on, and actually I can read it. It's on my phone, so I'm not going to be able to share it. Give me just a second to pull it up. Okay. And it's going to be raw, so I might be able to figure the mistakes as we go along. And she's kind of talking about the history of 1888, their failures. Let's see. So coming back to Egypt, this may take a minute. Coming back to Egypt, and I can copy and paste it in the teacher chat maybe. Coming back to Egypt, they came out of Egypt, they're in the wilderness, and what do? Apostasy. It's the history of the golden calf. So just to give the structure again, there's failure, then there's a failure, there's a failure in the wilderness as they come out of Egypt. Because of their failures throughout this history, we discussed two of them. They go into captivity. So two failures, and they go into captivity. They come out of Babylon seemingly cured of idolatry, and we'll discuss the failures in that history. And then they go into captivity to Rome. So the issues that they face is there's repeating failure, and then finally at the end, success. The Alpha history is one of failure. The Omega history is one of success. It's the exact same pattern we see with modern Israel. We've already identified, and for anybody that wasn't with us when we were discussing before, we're just kind of reviewing something from a previous presentation about the compare and contrast. That's the point I'm trying to get at. The compare and contrast, the difference between and the why the contrast is important. The Alpha history is one of failure. The Omega is one of success. It's the exact same pattern we see with modern Israel. We've already identified, we did it last week in the quotes from evangelism, that Christ should have come back in 1868. So sometime between 1798 and 1868, in those 70 years, Christ should have been able to return. He couldn't, he was delayed. So this was the Alpha history, failure. He should have returned by 1868 within those 70 years. Then we have the history of 1888. Again, the third angel's message was crying. Sunday laws were already in the United States. Everything had been set up. God's people just needed to be ready for it, and they weren't. It was a history of failure. So we know we are in the Omega history, the history of success. So there was two histories of failure. We saw that she went through the history of Egypt. There was two histories of failure, and then they go into captivity. Okay, we're seeing that structure. That's the structure that we're seeing, that shows the two histories of failure and a history of success. So we know that we're in a history of success. So when we see ancient and modern Israel, we take them as a parable. Ancient and modern Israel, we take them as a parable and compare and contrast them. What we can compare is the structure The structure is the same for ancient as it is for modern. You have the darkness, the messenger, the coming out, the prophet, I got a word here that didn't transcribe well. The Sabbath, sorry. It doesn't say Sabbath at all. So the failures of Google voice type. So you have the darkness, the messenger, the coming out, the prophet, the Sabbath, and also histories of apostasy, failure, and success. But what are the contrasts? So she's talking about those are the things that you compare that are the similarities. What are the contrasts between ancient and modern? We've spoken about the comparisons. I want us to think about the contrasts and she's putting the comparisons to the structures. The structure is the same. We spoke about the comparisons. I want us to think about the contrast because a parable always has contrasts. They are never identical. You can see that all through Christ's parables, the shepherd and the sheep. It's the easiest one we always mention. There's nothing about your physical structure that looks like a sheep. There's many comparisons. So we don't look like a sheep. There's comparisons, but we don't look like the actual structure. We don't look like a sheep. So what are the comparisons? But there are many contrasts. What is the contrast between ancient Israel and modern Israel? The contrast, I think, is most crucial to see is ancient Israel. Now she's going to break it down to what is in this particular, is a theocracy. So even though the structures are the same, the contrast is that ancient Israel is a theocracy. It's a combination. I might have, this might be a typo in my thing, but they're a theocracy. And then modern Israel is a church and state, a combination of church and state. Ancient Israel is a theocracy. Modern Israel, is it a theocracy? Modern Israel is a separation of church and state. So that's right, it's a theocracy, sorry. It's a theocracy, a combination of church and state. Ancient Israel is a theocracy, it's a combination of church and state. Modern Israel is it a theocracy? No, because modern Israel is a separation of church and state. It's God's people, it's a church, and you find that there has been a wall placed between the church and state. So this is the contrast. The structures are the same, but you're looking at what the contrast is. And in the case of ancient and modern Israel, ancient is a theocracy, union of church and state. Israel, let's see, union of church and state, and modern is a separation of church and state. And this is one seemingly small issue. The fact that we have to contrast as well as to compare is where much of Protestantism has fallen. This is their main stumbling block, because many people, they can look to the Word of God and they can make a comparison. That's quite easy to do. Ancient Israel, modern Israel, glorious land, modern glorious land. And then in the United States, in the South, and then in the 1850s and 60s, what are they going to say? The ancient glorious land had slavery, modern glorious land has slavery. So they can compare, but they cannot contrast because they don't know how to use parables. Our ability to contrast is often what also makes our message special, because it prevents us from making those mistakes and enables us to explain much of what Protestantism and Adventism either misinterpret or they choose to ignore. More often within Adventism than not, they just choose to ignore everything that they cannot explain or don't want to talk about. So they go with the comparisons, and that's how they come to believing that slavery is okay in the history of the Civil War. So this ability to contrast is important. And the greatest contrast we need to be aware of between ancient and modern is that one is a theocracy and one is a separation of church and state. This starts to become particularly relevant when you define the glorious land. That's where it starts to become, it can confuse some people, because here, when you have a church and state, ancient, you have the church God's people, and the state rules the glorious land. So when you separate the two, you have to be careful how you understand the glorious land. The glorious land in the United States. And if you're not able to contrast ancient and modern Israel, what will you do? You'll end up trying to enforce a theocracy in the United States, a church and state union, which is exactly where Protestantism has battled with over the last 300 years. So can you see, by not contrasting, they can't see that there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. Did that make sense? It's why they are uniting church and state. They see the theocracy in the past and they think that that's what we are supposed to do now. Did that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
So I don't know that I want this structure necessarily to go through, but it does have the you've got the darkness, captivity, lost the Sabbath, then you have a messenger and a messenger, then you have you have Moses, the prophet, they reinstitute the Sabbath. You have Ellen White, the prophet, reinstitute the Sabbath. So the structure is the same, but by not contrasting, they're not able, they carry the entire package, if that's a correct way, I don't know, to say it, into our history and want to repeat it. So that affects them when it comes to, like, I'm going to close out of that one and go into the other one.
I noticed the black spaces, so
they're still there. I'll get rid of that. Thank you. I don't see them, so.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, if I saw them, I'd probably go, I'd remember, but I don't see them. So thank you for letting me know, because I don't see them on my end. Oh, gotta get back. I wanted to go back. We're on slide 27. I wanted to just jump back to here. So just the basic then for us, these are the structures, right? This is the structure that was opened up. We saw this opened up, the In God We Trust opened up in Brazil in 2019, the three histories of Protestantism, seeing the two histories of failure and then a history of success. And I think that came from, maybe somebody can correct me, but that came from the studies of Pyrrhus, wasn't it? With the king of the north, the king of the south, the failure, success. I might have that wrong. So if I do, somebody help me with that. But how you can know a history of success, or maybe that was another witness to it, and I might have that confused. So hopefully not.
Yeah, one of the witnesses.
What?
One of the witnesses.
Yeah. So this is a structure. What we're looking at is a structure. You've got three themes. You have Adventism, you have the papacy, and you have Protestantism. And then within that structure, you see three histories. And in those three histories, the first two are failures and the last one is a success. So that's what you compare, is the structure. But then when you get down to, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, this is the way I picture it in my head. When you get down to the details, you can, and look at the contrast, you can see that the issue of failure was different, right? The issues of failure were different, and to help us to understand our history. But I'm taking this one here in particular, makes it a little bit easier to see, because you saw that each history had a threat, right? There was a threat and then there was a response, but the threats were different and therefore the response was different. But they're just taking the comparisons and brought this into modern history without the contrasts. So you need both to be able to understand the lines. Did that make sense?
Yes, that's helpful to me.
Anybody have questions on that? Okay, so we'll pick up back where we were at. So that that little piece really helped me a lot. I hope it helped you, but it really helped me a lot. Okay, so we're still in, I think it's the Guadalupe camp meeting is what we're doing here. Presentation number 3 was the Crusade of Billy Graham. The study of In God We Trust has that second movement in the 1950s. So we're discussing that history and the connection between 1888 to today, how fundamentalism was revived and rebranded under Billy Graham in the history of the Cold War, increasingly in union with the US presidents and US government. We discussed how Protestants changed their view on Roe versus Wade, and at that point, still the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism. We discussed how Billy Graham failed, that whole movement failed. It's soon after those 3 civil rights movements brought a new threat to Christian nationalism. So this history here failed. And then soon after you have these 3 issues here that lead us to this history here. We discussed how Billy Graham failed, that whole movement failed, and it's soon after these 3 civil rights movements brought a new threat to Christian nationalism. Civil rights, second wave feminism, Stonewall, LGBT. We discussed how Protestantism relates to those threats and how Adventism relates to those perceived threats. So we saw there's a threat and then there's a mobilization and a response. And the threat is different in each history. And we went through this before, seeing communism is the threat in this history here. And then here it's with immigration and blacks and Muslims, and then also gender, and then socialism is still in here as a threat. So it relates to those threats and how Adventism relates to those perceived threats. And we move from here, we move from there to then wanting to understand the papacy's position and understanding their true position, the true position on these issues of equality held by Pope Francis, who we understand as the counterfeit. And that also led into understanding the cultural feminism as well with Pope Francis later. So in presentation 4, the test that shipwrecks 2 institutions. In the context of what had all been discussed before we look at the ideology that unites Catholicism, Protestantism, and Adventism, and with that ideology, the methodology that unites Catholicism, Protestantism, and Adventism. Then again, in the last point, we discussed again the habit of members of the movement going into Laodicean liberal Adventism to locate information. So coming out of conservatism, 2019, and then wanting to go into liberal Adventism to find information. And she emphasizes how the test is, or the, I don't want to say the test, I don't remember how she says it, but it's harder in it to identify, because the previous dispensation, 2014 to 2019, it was easy, it was good guys versus bad guys, but now you're looking at the liberals who were the good guys in that previous dispensation, and now we need to break down what was the good guys in that history, if that's a fair way to say that, and going there to find information, and where she cautions on being very careful of our sources because of biases and I think mainly because of bias was the main one that she put on the board, not on this discussion, but bias was one of the main ones. And every single time this is done, people start imbibing error. Even if it's incorporating a little bit of deceptive truth, it's still error. We have 5 presentations to go. 2 of them were the Q&As done in the French world. It's hard to suggest what should be watched if you go back and watch. My hope is that we look for the structures, love the structures, and make sure we're not losing track of the increase of knowledge. I would recommend the last presentation, number 4 of Guadalupe, should be watched. And that would be the one, the test that shipwrecks 2 institutions, this one that we're talking about. April 10th, an unpopular message. again, the complicated theme of the harvest, it's put me at odds with many people, is that after all, put me at odds is that after all I said about FFA in 2019, I'm attacking liberal Adventism and liberal society. People are struggling to adapt to that level of criticism, not expecting her to go from criticizing FFA and conservatism. Now, why are you attacking liberal Adventism and liberal society? People are struggling to adapt to that level of criticism. If you just want to say Trump is bad, we have moved a dispensation beyond that. So we have to look at this dispensation and see now what's wrong with liberal Adventism and liberal society. So particularly here, I start pushing the subject of gender. It can be prophetically proven that gender is the test today and not racism. So we go back to Millerite history. And again, this would be using that compare and contrast, because what was the South using to justify slavery?
The Bible.
The Bible, right? So when you take a thus saith the Lord and you progress through history, I don't know how I'm going to say, I don't know how to say that. If somebody knows what I'm going to try to say, so it's like you're inside of my head, but you can't take a thus saith the Lord and carry it through history, because when you look at the whole Eden to Eden line, it's a restoration. And so you can't take the Bible and say, well, there was racism and there was slavery in the Bible, therefore racism and slavery is okay. You have to be willing to look at the contrasts to be able to rightly understand our dispensation and what that test is, and what Eden to Eden and the other things led us to was to understand the issue of gender. So she starts pushing the subject of gender, and it can be prophetically proven that gender is the test today and not racism. So we go back to Millerite history and look at when racism was the test for the people of God, and see that their understanding of racial equality was above and beyond that of liberal society. So she's talking about the Millerites, that their understanding of racial equality was above and beyond that of liberal society. So our understanding of gender equality must be above and beyond liberal mainstream society. We began to look at various gender stereotypes. So see the danger then of those that were in that history, 2019 to 2021, that were looking for liberal sources to understand who we are supposed to be and what we represent. Did that make sense? And so great caution is needed because of the biases involved in what she's saying. It in the Millerite history, the Millerites themselves were above and beyond racial equality of liberal society when it came to racial equality. So we have to be above and beyond liberal mainstream society when it comes to gender. So they can't answer the questions we have. And we have to be careful with our sources. So we began to look at various gender stereotypes that most people have imbibed and don't even realize it, particularly around the STEM subject. And maybe somebody can explain STEM. I know it, but I'm not. It has to do with science and somebody scholarly with us that in mathematics. What else?
STEM.
Science. I forget what the T is. Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
Technology, I think. It's T.
English.
Engineering.
Oh, engineering.
E is engineering.
Mathematics.
Yeah.
Okay.
It has to do with technology.
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
I believe so.
Okay, it's on
Yes.
one of the boards somewhere. I don't know about it in this study, but I know that I saw it on one of the boards written out. It was probably in one of these studies, but I don't remember where. Maybe it's coming up, and that's why. I'm in too many places at once. So, okay, STEM. So they don't even realize, particularly around the STEM subject. Let's see. We began to look at various gender stereotypes that most people have imbibed and don't even realize it, particularly around the STEM subject, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And then answering a question or a statement someone had made that we cannot tell whether or not someone is sexist because we cannot read the heart. My argument is, yes, we can. Susan, when we were looking at Desire of Ages today, in that passage, explain that to me. I don't know how to ask a question. Explain this to me. We cannot tell whether or not someone is sexist because we cannot read the heart. My argument is, yes, we can. What did we learn in that passage that we were reading about the time of harvest, or actually the formalization?
Are you referring to, well, it stems from Phil's study last night and the change of character and the humility and the spirit of Christ, the fruits that will be displayed in a person? Is that what you're referring
Yeah, that would
to?
relate to it too. I was just thinking specifically on the paragraph in Desire of Ages that we were looking at, where it talks.
Yeah, I can't remember all the words in that paragraph. I'm sorry,
That's
but it
okay.
had to do with conforming to the world. And anyway,
Anybody else? What were we focusing
Just
on?
throw it out there, actions.
Say that again.
I would say actions,
Actions versus what?
profession.
Right. Right. So she says that, and then answering a question or a statement someone had made, this statement that we can't tell whether someone is sexist or not. She says, my argument is, yes, we can. You don't have to read the heart because the actions is what comes from the heart, right?
Yes,
With your lips, you profess, but with your heart is far from me. Use your actions actually demonstrate what's in your
Exactly.
heart. So you can profess, and you can even go out and copy this message verbatim and still be sexist, but it'll be seen. And it's seen because of the information that we have been blessed to receive. Otherwise, I mean, I still know that I don't see some of the subtleties of it. Does that make sense? So we're able to see things through prophetic eyes, see things in new light because we have correct understanding. So you can see it. So anyway, so she states that we had two Q&As in the French world, and she left them out of this review here. Perhaps one thing that I addressed in those Q&As that I think would be important was the question about what message we give to the Levites and the Nethinims. Let me pause for just 1 second. I'll be right back.
So I'll read that paragraph out loud just for the recording. So I believe Elaine was talking about the one paragraph that we read this morning in Desire of Ages, chapter 37. Part of it's paragraph 357.2. Men may deny Christ by evil speaking, by foolish talking, by words that are untruthful or unkind. They may deny him by shunning life's burdens, by the pursuit of sinful pleasure. They may deny him by conforming to the world, by uncourteous behavior, by the love of their own opinions, by justifying self, by cherishing doubt, borrowing trouble, and dwelling in darkness.
Thank you for that little brief intermission. Sorry about that. I apologize. So yeah, so you can read the heart because it shows in the actions. So, and that's what, to me, that passage was a lot about, was the difference there between profession and action. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but so anyway, so the
Yeah,
Q&A,
Elaine?
huh?
Yeah, Jackie.
Yeah.
I'm throwing this out there just because we need all of us, especially me, maybe others are thinking of this too. When we say actions that we see, but yet where do we have to be careful with judging? Because we would be accused of that, wouldn't we?
Well, when you take in consideration that we're in a time of, we're learning about compromise,
Right.
I think you call out sexism when you see it.
Yeah, so
Call out
this is
sexism.
like, it's not a peace and safety thing
No,
at
and
all,
it's not
in any
received,
way, shape, or form.
right, and it's not received well either by
Yep,
someone that doesn't
absolutely.
want to give up their, so prayerfully, we're understanding that and understanding how challenging it can be sometimes, and how we could be prone to shrink, and shrinking is compromise,
Very true.
right?
Yes, instead of holding firm to calling it out
Yeah,
where it needs to be called out,
yeah,
because it's a life and death message.
right, right.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, this is just the board work again from what she's just talking about, the test that shipwrecks 2 institutions. And the 2 institutions we know are Adventism in the United States here, the shipwreck. So the next presentation is the 26th of June, Information War and the Lab Leak Theory. This is kind of a separate thread, a standalone study. And again, you don't know it till the end, but I'm being critical of the left wing. Not because they are worse or the same as right wing, but because they still can make the same mistakes and have the same rebranded conservatism. And that's the point that was made in the, well, maybe it was in part 1, because I think it was last week when we talked about it. And I think it's been in another couple of studies that I did, but that's how she identifies the dangers of liberalism, because it's really just rebranded conservatism. So here we really took a close look at COVID-19, the conspiracy theories surrounding the pandemic, and the weight of evidence. We also wanted to have an accurate mental picture of where these coronaviruses develop, and as our own vaccine against the anti-Asian racism that has developed against them. And this was the board work. It's really tricky to get the board work when she's there. So you have to get it in pieces and put it together. But she shows the origin of these coronaviruses. And let's see here. We'll have to go through this one. I know somebody's going to go through this one for us when we get there. So we'll get to go through that.
Elaine?
Yes, it's you, right?
Yeah. Is this the one where she was talking about John Stewart?
You know, she might have mentioned John Stewart in this one as well. I know she's mentioned him in something else that I just recently went through. Maybe it's this one. It might
In
be
a bad way, yeah.
Actually, it might be in this one.
Yeah, because that's what I remember. Because I was very surprised when I watched the same video that she did with him talking about, I think it was with Stephen Colbert, and I thought he was joking at first, like with what he was saying about lab leak theory, but soon I realized that he was actually believing it, and I'm like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think it probably is this one where she mentions him. I think she's brought him up before or in other places. Okay, so the 10th of July, having a form of godliness. This is just another way of saying the ape is bull. There's a standalone part at the beginning of the study where we discuss how the movement leadership now wishes to relate to the titles of brother and sister. Putting that to one side, this is just another layer of the ape is bull. Trying to get people to see this comparison, compare and contrast between racism and sexism, needs to be deep and needs to be personal. So we go deeper on that compare and contrast and show just how the APIS bull warned us over and over again. Members of the movement are not approaching gender equality in the right light, and that progressive society is not our template for gender equality. That progressive, she's meaning liberals, right? You come out of conservatism and then you have the progressive society or the liberals. They are not our template for gender equality. It is where we are comfortable, but it is not where God demands that we be. A quote to finish it discusses that holiness is not in a profession, but in practice. That was the word I was looking for earlier when I said action, practice. People in this movement that say, I love gender equality, listen to all my words of profession, but ignorance and blindness are not practicing it. I'll come back to this point at the end, one more presentation. So the 24th of July, 2014 was the HERO Act, and somebody, I think it was Susan that brought up, it's not referred to as the HERO Act, is that correct? Just HERO Act?
Well, when I looked it up, first on the board, when she initially did that presentation listing all the things under 2014 when we were all participating, remember him calling out the different events? She just wrote HERO -trans. And so that's what I went with in the beginning. I typed in HERO, all capital letters though, because I figured it had to be an acronym. And so and then I heard someone else say HERO Act, so I tried that too. And because I thought I was wrong when I did HERO trans, because it brought me to Houston, the bathroom. It was Houston's, I thought I was sort of right, but I also got confused by the word act, right? Because that HERO bill that in Houston wasn't an act. So I thought, well, maybe I'm not right. So when I put in HERO Act, it brought up the most recent law that had nothing to do with the bathroom. And she was referring to the bathroom. Remember the arguments about, the men are going to go into that women's bathroom. They honed in on it as like it was a bathroom act, and it had nothing to do with bathrooms. And so what I learned was there's two separate things. There's something called the HERO Act, and it's completely different. And then there's HERO, which was enacted in Houston.
Yeah, I think we found that.
So I don't think, yeah, go ahead.
I think we saw that the HERO Act was the coronavirus, one of the coronaviruses packages that was put together. The one that
Yep.
It had to do with the
Something about medical and all that too.
So just to have, the whole package. So just to have that clear and straight, what she's talking about here is the issue relating to trans. 2014 in the HERO Act, but it wasn't called ACT, right? It wasn't called ACT, but it has to do with.
Not that I found, and unless someone can find different. And HERO is all capital letters because it stands for Houston Equal Rights.
Right.
I think it was Ordinance.
Okay. Yes, I think you're right. Okay, so people had questions relating to the terms brother and sister. So I enlarged on what I said in the presentation before to give some context and explanation. Then I moved back into the topic of gender stereotypes, how prolific stereotypes are, how unscientific and how damaging. Then we looked at where sexism comes from, where prejudice originates. And now you'll notice a slight shift in the studies. Everyone knows that the subject of women's rights of gender connects to LGBT. And we would be amiss to introduce any topic without taking it to our reform line. So we looked at the issue in society of trans people, trans identity, the difference between biological sex and gender identity, and the disinformation that surrounds this topic. And then we looked at our reform line because this subject of LGBTQ has become an extremely politically divisive weapon. So you would expect that it connects to 2014 in our reform line and to the conspiracy theories, two streams of information. So that was in 2014, correct? The Houston, say it again.
HERO, the Houston Equal Rights
Right.
Ordinance, was in 2014, but the HERO Act is more now, like 2021, I think it was.
Yeah. So this was connecting the trans issue to 2014, trans people, biological sex and gender, it linked to 2014. Okay, and this was her board work on there as well. Physical difference between men and women, female weaker. The law must protect the weaker ones. I think that says must thus be able to identify, I think is what it says. And the toilet problem, that would be Houston, correct? I can't quite make that out. So this will be good to review as well when we get to that part as well, and the differences between biological sex and gender identity. So that's as far as, then this was August 21st, I believe, as far as we've gotten in our studies. Camp meeting beginning a few days from now, and that camp meeting would have been the next one, was the IPR one. I thought that this would be useful to share the website and document that traces our journey. Many people have become unsettled as we've moved from the latter rain to the harvest, and we know now we're in the harvest of the Levites at this point. That point, we were still in the harvest of the priests. Moved from easy of seeing Trump as the enemy to the hard of seeing the Whig Party and the Democrat Party. And this also brought us to understand compromise and how that impacts what we should expect to see regarding our internal experience. Many people saying or making the profession that they love equality, but loving just warped, rebranded conservatism, not following in practice what God is stipulating is absolutely necessary. Canada was the first presentation of the increase of knowledge, the same time that we're looking at the Apis bull. We're given that parable of the path, and it's become like a chant in this movement. It's okay, I'm holding the cords. They chant, I'm holding the cords. That's supposed to be cords. What does it mean to hold the cords in the dispensation of compromise? In the dispensation of the Apis bull warning about blindness to sexism, what does it mean to be that chant, to be I'm holding the cords? Is it reasonable to compromise, and then say it's okay because I'm holding the cords? So is it reasonable, is it okay to compromise and say that it's okay to compromise because I'm holding on to the cords? As if chanting the phrase saves you. It's like eating fried chicken and saying it's okay, I'm on a diet. It doesn't work that way. The definition of holding the cords means to not compromise. It doesn't mean to say I'm going to be sexist, I'm going to mix my favorite idolatry with the midnight cry. I'm going to compromise in my relationships and behavior, but I'm going to hold the cords because I will stubbornly not leave the movement despite my behavior. So just emphasizing the saying I'm holding the cords, but yet compromising. So this, I think these are just extra board works that I threw in at the end. Actually, they were just there as a holding place for me. But this was from the Politics of Evasion, the myths, the three myths in the Democrat Party of why they were losing elections, the myth of liberal fundamentalism, the myth of mobilization, the myth of congressional bastion, and then comparing that with the Laodicean. This would be the liberals, the Democrat, and this being the external. This would be the internal. We've got to have success, or the reason for compromise as well, because the whole theme here is compromise. You must have success with Adventism in the world, so you're going to have to compromise. Grace, love, and tolerance, got to show them grace, love, and tolerance. But if you do, when you do show grace, love, and tolerance, and this requires, I believe, wisdom to understand it correctly, But when you take the approach of this grace, love, and tolerance, you're without the correct without understanding correctly, you're going to compromise the message. And I think I mentioned it earlier, when you compromise the message, you destroy your witness to the person that you are witnessing to. And that's why it's no compromise, zero compromise, because you're going to destroy your witness to the very person you're trying to witness to by compromise. And the other thing that Laodicean is saying is that sexism isn't everything. If sexism is the test, then sexism is everything. Many people think that they're holding the cords when they have long let them go, and they don't know how far back the path they've already run. It's just like saying, just stick to the ship. That ship is a message. That message has no power in profession. Its power is in practice. You cannot abandon practice and claim the profession and then say you'll make it because you're blindly clinging to the ship. You compromise in profession and you practice, you're already off the ship. The formalization of the message is a frightening thing. And we're not even near the Sunday law yet. And remember, this was done in August 21st, 2021. This document that has been shared will be posted on the media broadcast as we prepare for the formalization of the message. We need to consider the implications of the increase of knowledge. So remember that you have a message that arrives, then you have an increase of knowledge, then the formalization. And the formalization, the message and the increase of knowledge is easy. When you get to the formalization of the message, then you have the implications of it. So we need to consider the implications of that increase of knowledge on our personal place in profession and practice. In the history when liberal society is not your friend, and if what has been taught seems now unfamiliar, then revisit. And there was some inaudible spots. That was one of them that I could not get. And in a few short days, I'll see you again. Let's hold on to the cords, profession and practice without compromise. I don't understand people making choices for temporal pleasure. Look at the world. It's either burning or drowning, and I don't mean symbolically anymore. A few short years of an easier life are not worth it. Your hope is in this message. And then we'll just go ahead and go through her prayer. Dear Lord, thank you that even in the time of trouble, you didn't leave us alone. Like a true father and mother, you nurtured us and fed us, warned us, for giving us the freedom to make our own decisions and our own mistakes. We know you've promised this is a history of success, but in a few short years, we don't want to come to the throne of God and have you show us the success that could have been if we all did our job properly. So we ask now that you strengthen us, prepare us. May we represent you to a literally and spiritually dying world. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. I think that's, he's warned us. It's like these messages give us the warning, and we have the freedom to make our own decision based on them. And so that's all of that. Any comments or thoughts you want to share?
Like it was shared in the chat, it's a solid message.
Yeah. Yeah.